Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Jock Reynolds here, your director, and very, very pleased to greet you here today for what's going to be a wonderful lecture delivered by Taco Dibbits, the director of the Rijksmuseum, who's come here from Amsterdam via Boston, more about which I'll tell you in a few moments. But what I want to tell you first is that I want to offer thanks to many, many of you who are in this audience. This is the first of the John Walsh Lecture and Education Series that's being delivered. And due to gifts of money from more than 220 of you, we now have a major John Walsh endowment for John Walsh Lectures and Education, for the kind of slow looking and teaching that John has done here for many, many years, but especially over the last 4 years, where we've been able to borrow extensively from the wonderful Dutch Golden Age painting collection of Rosemary and Ike van Otterloo, who are here with us today in the front row and with their good friend, Taco. And I just learned that, in fact, Taco, before he went to the Rijksmuseum, was an intern of John Walsh's at the Getty Museum. I mean, how? And not only that, Marissa Bass, one of our great young professors, who's trained at Harvard and now here at Yale teaching Northern European art from 1400 to 1700, also was an intern of Taco's at the Rijksmuseum. I mean, it goes on and on. I've just thrown my remarks out to say that I need to improvise a little bit in saying that it's been an enormous pleasure these last 4 years to be able to borrow fantastic works of art from the Van Otterloo collection, and as you know, to display them here for all of you to enjoy, for our students to benefit from, particularly not only the great lectures that John's given, but the other people in the field who he's invited here to lecture. All of this has really made a great contribution to the study, particularly of Nederlandse art. And it's been recently announced, I think you all know, that the great collections of the Weatherbys and the Otterloos is being made a gift to the MFA in Boston. And they have invited both the Harvard University Museum and Yale University Art Gallery to be their preferred lenders for what we hope will be a major ongoing program to train people to learn more and care more about the great arts of the Nederlandse culture. And we also know that Taco, and we hope that we're going to have a real cross-Atlantic collaboration with your wonderful Rijksmuseum. The Rijksmuseum, by the way, was founded in 1800. The Yale Art Gallery, we came along a little later in 1832, but it was first founded in The Hague, and then in 1808 it was moved by Napoleon to Amsterdam so it could have its own separation from the king in The Hague. And then by, I think it was about 1985 it was, you got your own real building there. I mean, 1890, yeah. And there's another very interesting coincidence, is that the plan to ultimately renovate and expand and reinstall the Rijksmuseum collection began first in 2001 and then really got underway for a 10-year renovation in 2003. That also almost perfectly coincides with what we were doing here at Yale. We closed the Louis Kahn building in 2003. We started the program thinking about it in 2001 and opened in 12/12/12. So we think there's a lot of synchronicity here amongst these institutions, and we're delighted, again, wanting to thank Rosemary and Ike for the wonderful loans that we know now are going to continue in a generous fashion. I want to mention there will be a wonderful study day being conducted on February 2nd up in Boston with colleagues from Harvard and Yale, but also others in the field coming to talk about how this new center is going to get underway. And so to have Taco here today to talk about the history of his own institution and the wonderful work he's done, first as a young curator, then as director of collections, and now director of the museum. You can see he's only about 32 or 33. This is perfect, this idea that we're making way for a younger generation as part of the whole deal here. So, Taco, I want to thank you for coming. He's told me at the end of his remarks, which he doesn't want to keep going on and on, he would love to take some questions from any of you. And then some of you have, I think, signed up for some of the close looking that John Walsh has often done. You can go up in the galleries, those of you who've done that, and spend a little time with him before he needs to leave. So, Taco, again, I want to just say it's an enormous pleasure to meet you personally, to learn about these relationships we already have with colleagues we both know and enjoy. And I want to thank also Marissa Bass, Nicholas Suter, Larry Cantor, Ian McClure, the whole team here that's made this 4-year experience with Dutch art so rich for all of us, all of you in the audience, and especially the young learners and scholars who are entering the field. So Taco, if you will, come up and tell us a story or two. Thank you. And one more thing, but I should mount. The second, third, and fourth lectures of the Walsh series I forgot to announce. Next week, the guy right there in the front row, Larry Cantor, will give a lecture. Same time, Friday, on the young Frangelico. Larry did the famous Frangelico retrospective at the Met. The week after that, on the 9th, Paul Goldberger, the great student of Vincent Scully, is going to give a lecture, Architecture, and Vincent Scully, Architecture and the Power of Language. And then Ann Temkin, one of our greatest alumna graduates from the Museum of Modern Art, will come and speak about how this collection changed her life, who's now the creator of modern painting and sculpture at MoMA. So what a wonderful way to start this Walsh lecture series. And again, great thanks for all of you. You've been so generous to endow this program, which means it's going to go on for in perpetuity, and in perpetuity is a long time. Taco, please.
The nice thing is that we directors, I don't know if you can hear me. The nice thing is that we directors come and go, but the art stays. So that must be quite comforting. Probably after you've heard my story, it is even more comforting. I'm starting with this sculpture around 1600 by a Dutch artist, the Keizer, of a small boy who's being stung by a bee. Obviously, it's a reference to antiquity, Cupid being stung by a bee, but he's shouting. And I will shout at you for the coming hour. If I go on too long, please say stop, and I'd love to take questions. But I also show it because it is really what the Rijksmuseum is about. It's the museum, the National Museum of the Netherlands, and it's a museum that wants to be always of today and always young, like we all want to be. The face of the museum, of the Rijksmuseum, if you think about it as a person, is Rembrandt. He is the artist, I think the artist in the world best at depicting us as human beings, as individuals, as who we are, in all our beauty, in all our sorrow, in all our ugliness, in all our joy. Rembrandt depicts us all. And he has not been always the core of the collection. When the collection was founded, and indeed I think the Dutch are the only people, or maybe even the people in the Rijksmuseum, we are the only people who are very grateful to Napoleon, because he was the one who founded our museum and who made Amsterdam the capital city of the Netherlands. He founded a museum which had to have an art collection, a Dutch art collection, it was stipulated, and always one room with historical objects and one room with a library. And it was founded at a castle outside The Hague, and soon moved by Napoleon to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam it was housed at the palace of Napoleon's brother, Louis Napoleon. And after that it moved to a house on the canals, which was a house that was far too small for it. And soon it started to grow and grow because people started to donate objects to the museum. The state, we had at that time a very mean king who didn't want to spend on art, so the state didn't spend on art. It was really a collection that was built very much in a sense that is done in America as well by the people. Then in the end of the 1870s, so we're already 70 years into the history of the museum, it was decided that there should be a large national museum, a Rijksmuseum, built in Amsterdam on a plot of land that was given by the city to the state. And I'm saying this, you might think, but the state owns the city. Well, with Amsterdam, it's a different case. The people in Amsterdam are quite stubborn. They have their own mind, and they feel that they are a small republic within the state, within the kingdom of the Netherlands. This is historically set as well, because Amsterdam, as you know, there was a war between the Dutch and the Spanish in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century. It's now 400 years ago. But Amsterdam was the city that fought for the longest time on the Spanish side. So they always wanted to have a special position. it was decided that a museum should be built, and of course the examples in the world were the British Museum and museums that looked like Greek temples. And what happened in this Protestant city of Amsterdam? Lo and behold, the architect who won the competition was a man called Kuipers, and he was a Catholic. He is the man who built this building, now still the Rijksmuseum. It opened its doors in 1885, and there were a few stipulations. The town had given the museum or the plot of land to the state, stipulating that it could be a museum, but it also had to be a city gate. The gate to the new developments which were meant to be developed behind here. And here you can see there were only 2 buildings up, but now there is an entire neighborhood which was built at the beginning of the 20th century. So a city gate and a museum at the same time, and it was to serve the public, teaching art and history. The museum of the nation. The museum opened in 1885. The then king and queen refused to set foot in the museum because they said it's like a cloister. We will not set foot in a Catholic place. And they weren't present at the opening. It was the biggest building in the Netherlands. And the shock was that Kuipers built this cathedral for the arts, but he also built the central station, the train station. So when you would arrive as a tourist to Amsterdam, and we sometimes underestimate the importance of the building of train stations, because this suddenly made it possible to travel by train from France, from Paris to Amsterdam, and loads of artists. We have books in which artists had to write their name if they wanted to copy in the museum. Loads of artists came suddenly from France. You might all remember Miro, who did his Dutch interiors. He came on the train to Amsterdam and worked there. So the train station, a Catholic cathedral for trains. The Rijksmuseum, a cathedral for art and history. It was a huge building, as I said, the largest building in the Netherlands, and the collection was far too small. There were 700 works of art, there were 700 paintings, and to give you an idea, now we've got nearly 7,000 paintings. It was a museum that needed to be filled, but the day it opened, there were too many spaces. So the architect, Kuipers, decided to make an exhibition of the building itself, to have it the show on the ground floor, on the main floor, have it show all architectural styles represented in the Netherlands. So it was truly eclectic. He also felt that there should be more attention for the Catholic history of the Netherlands and all his important historical moments that weren't already depicted by the paintings in it, were depicted on the outside of the building in tiles, large tile tableaus, which depicted scenes from history. The important man, and at that time not women, although there were many more important women than we think, were depicted in these arches. So the building itself also told the history of the Netherlands. And he obviously felt that there were important moments, Catholic moments in the history of the Netherlands, subjects that none of us have ever heard of, but he made them very important. And saints that we had never heard of, they were suddenly depicted in the National Museum. And he really felt that it should be not a temple, but a cathedral that lifts you up, that enlightens you, and that is a cathedral for the arts. 1885, Rembrandt by that time had already become the most important artist of the Netherlands, and the Rijksmuseum was to be probably a piece you would now think of contemporary art as often marketed. The Rijksmuseum was the biggest marketing campaign for the Night Watch, the main and the most important painting we have in the museum. This is it. I'm just going back because, so this was the painting it was all about. And Kuipers designed a building that was, the floor plan was like a Renaissance palazzo with inner courtyards. And here, between these two columns, the night watch was to be hung. The visitor would enter in the front hall, the voorhal as we call it, which had large, you will see it later, large stained glass windows. And then as in a procession, you could walk to the high altar, the night watch, passing different side chapels to walk towards it. So it was really the entire building was planned around the high altar, the night watch. And what kind of painting it is. I will today not talk about it, because that you have to come to Amsterdam to see the real thing. Not talk about the painting that much, but the importance for it for the Netherlands and why it was promoted so much was because in France you would have expected at the high altar a portrait of Louis XIV. In Italy you would expect Christ on the cross, but what did the Netherlands do? They put on the high altar the people, and in this case the people of Amsterdam. So it was very clear that it was propagating the country as a civic country with a civic power, and the people depicted in it are still the people that are important today. And you might guess who they are. They are lawyers, first of all, of course, and they are pharmacists, secondary, also very important, and then they are traders, are merchants. And those were the men of Amsterdam who were meant to protect, as a civic guard, to protect the city against the Spanish. But when we say protect the city against the Spanish at that time, and you might remember that I said before, the Dutch, the people from Amsterdam remained pro-Spanish for a long time. At that time, they weren't, this is 1642, so just before the end of the war. It was mainly to protect the city from internal unrest, and in a sense there were many internal unrests when it comes to religion. The Netherlands know over 50 types of Protestantism, so you can imagine they would quarrel endlessly over the Bible and over the word spoken, the word read, and often the militia, the civic guards, had to calm down the senses and had to calm riots down that were really quite fierce over disputes about how to read the Bible. The night watch, as I said, it depicts a militia. It was hanging in the middle, and each Dutchman who would visit the Rijksmuseum would immediately realize this is a country built by burghers, and this is a country administered by burghers. So it was intentionally put there as a political statement of how the country should be run. It was also, you could say, part of the collection of the town of Amsterdam. If you visit the Prado, you visit the collection of kings. If you visit the Louvre, you visit the collection that was started by kings. If you visit the Queen's Galleries in London, you see a collection from the 16th century of kings. And the Rijksmuseum had the collection of the city of Amsterdam, which is the Syndics by Rembrandt is also, in a sense, the old core of the collection. Even though it's a 19th century museum, these works were already in the town's administration since they were painted. I think this is sometimes I just show paintings because they're my favorites. So we have a million objects, but everybody has their favorites. And I think that when I said Rembrandt is the painter of the individual, I'm always amazed at how he is able to make all these people, to make all these men sitting from different religious denominations, sitting there as if it's very recognizable, as if it's the moment that you open a boardroom and you say, oh, sorry, wrong room, and you close it again. And that's exactly what Rembrandt does. But we, the visitor now, but he is the one distracting their annual board meeting of the syndics who are going through the ledgers with the annual report. And the movement, and I think that that's so core also with Rembrandt, not only the individual faces and their expressions, the movement is created by this man standing up, like, what are you doing here? Saying it to us, you're in the wrong room. He's making an argument, slapping with his hand on the ledger. I told you it was right. The other one is saying, let's move on. So holding the page and let's move on. And he has just arrived with his gloves still in his hand. So he arrived late. And it's that which Dutch 17th century art has, when you have as your goal to create a composition, to create a picture that is as lifelike as possible, and that's the way it was written about, as lifelike as possible, then as a painter, the hardest thing is to create movement in your painting. And I think that Rembrandt does it in a brilliant way here. And we feel, okay, we've got to close the door, but we want to stay and look at it for as long as possible. The museum consisted of different museums, in a sense. It was the Fine Art Museum, and this is a painting from when it had just opened. Here the rooms are very chock-full with paintings. All the 700 paintings were hanging, but there were other rooms that were nearly virtually empty, and Kuipers in those rooms had decorated them with large scenes from Dutch history. All the paintings were exhibited in these rooms, and they included rooms that were named after donors to the museum. So when the museum opened, not only did it have the Night Watch as a civic pride at the high altar, but also the rooms were named after the people who had donated pictures to the museum. It's interesting because that tradition in the States is still there. In the Netherlands, it has completely disappeared. But you had, for example, the room you saw before, where you see the Jewish bride hanging there, already very important because it had a little barrier in front of it and somebody copying it. That room was called the Van der Hoop room. A banker who had started collecting in the 19th century, who was very much following the fashion of collecting Rembrandt, Ruysdael, etc., what we now consider as the typical Dutch art. At that time, it wasn't. Late Rembrandt was not the most famous artist, and he really started collecting it. When he died, he left everything to the city of Amsterdam, and the city said, that's very nice, but you have to pay tax duty, and we're not going to pay the tax duty, so we're not going to accept this great gift. At that time, another group of patricians from the city said, okay, we will collect we will donate money so you can accept it, and we pay the death duties. And therefore the Rijksmuseum still has these fantastic works. But also this work by Ruysdael, which is the mill at Wijk bij Duurstede. And when you go there now, it's changed a little bit, but still it's incredible to see how similar it still is. And this was one of the paintings from the collectie Dupper, a man from Dordrecht who left his paintings to the museum in the early days. And so it grew, the collection grew and grew, and these fantastic paintings became really the icons of Dutch painting in the 20th century as well. And then there is the first big intervention of the state. The milkmaid by Vermeer. She was about to be sold to the US, and the Dutch said, no, this cannot happen. A committee was formed. In the Netherlands, everything goes by committee. A committee was formed, consensus was reached, it was brought into Parliament, and it was unanimously decided that this painting should be acquired for the country, and has been in the Rijksmuseum since the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it is, for Vermeer, it's incredible to see how well preserved it is, and that's a large part of its magic. You really feel his brushstroke and the way he indicates the brittleness of the bread and the breadcrumbs, and the way he, with little dots, you can still see them on the paint surface, and the way he depicted you can see even the brushstroke, the way he depicts the kind of dark blue skin of the milkmaid who's been cleaning probably often in cold water, the way he does that, and contrasts it with the blue behind it. It's an amazing painting, and it's again a painting that tells a story of a lady, or a maid in this case, standing in the dairy kitchen, a kitchen on the north. There is a window, but you see the mold. I always say it's the most beautiful plaster wall ever painted. You see the mold here under the window, from a window on the north. So a small hole in the window to show that it's really glass. Bread is in this chest, hanging up against mice. Then you know it's cold because there's a stove here with a little testje, as we call it in Dutch, a little piece of pottery within it, hot coals. And here is the milk. The milk will be delivered at the door from from the country, delivered at the door in large buckets, and you could buy milk, which you see here. The bread is taken out of that, and there's a pitcher with beer, which was used as yeast. So she is in the process, and that's why she's measuring so carefully. I think the tension of her hand holding and pouring at the same time, she's measuring so carefully because she's making a bread pudding with the yeast as beer, the old bread and milk. So also Vermeer creates a story of everyday life. And it's amazing, I think, how he's able to make this everyday scene into a monumental painting. As we sometimes call it, it's like a Dutch Madonna in a sense, because it is a monumental painting, even though it's this big. But to continue, another early acquisition was the little street by Vermeer. We've now, since 2 years ago, it was discovered by a professor from the University of Amsterdam, so that's why it's so important that you keep on training art historians. He discovered that this was the house of the aunt of Vermeer. So there was a very personal relation of Vermeer with her. But that was also one of the early works that came to the collection. The collection showed, as you saw before with Vermeer as well, showed a very Protestant side of Dutch art. This is one of the main history pieces of the collection, and we call it the Fishing for Souls. It was already in the collection since the 1830s. What you see here the Catholics, the Spanish Catholics, fishing for souls. Then obviously their boat is capsizing and they won't succeed to get any more in. Here you see the Spanish, and then here these men in black are the Dutch, the Protestants, and here they're fishing for their souls. And even though the building was Catholic, the collection was firmly confirming or affirming a Protestant view of life. So many portraits in people in very sober black and white dress. Very few, for example, the Dutch art about, very few flower still lifes, because those were considered too kind of joyful. And scenes of everyday life of hard-working people. So it was very much also reflecting a sense of the time in the 19th century. The second part, the second museum, so that was the Fine Art Museum, the second museum housed in the building, the Rijksmuseum, was the Museum for History, for National History. And I think that within Europe, as a national museum, the Rijksmuseum is singular, that it has a collection of fine art, of history paintings and objects. And these are, you might know, these fantastic pen paintings. These are huge pen paintings. There are 4 of them in a series made for one of the children of the admirals of the Dutch Navy in the 17th century by Van der Velde. That was part of the history collection. And this is an object, not very beautiful, but it is the object that saved the life of the founder of international law in the 17th century, Hugo Grotius, and he escaped in this chest for books. It's a long story, but I'm not going to tell it. But it is one of these icons of the Netherlands. Actually, I can't not tell it. It's quite a fascinating story. Now, the amazing thing about it is there's 3 of these, and we claim to have the real one, but there's 3 in the Netherlands. That's how popular he was. But Hugo de Groot wrote a letter. Grotius wrote a letter to his, his brother wrote a letter to him. He escaped in this box, left it with his brother, and the brother wrote a letter after a year or 2 saying, "Oh my gosh, I went to look for the chest and it's gone. I can't find it." And Hugo de Groot gets quite upset, writes back and says, "Well, you really have to search well, because that box shows God's willingness to let me escape." And then after a while they come to a compromise, because the brother found a chest that looks very much like it. Can that serve the goal? And Hugo de Groot says, yes, it can serve the goal. So there is no original box left, but this is the one that comes closest to it. But that's how already in the 17th century we wrote our own history. The third museum within the Rijksmuseum was the Museum for Applied Arts, which was often a choice. And one of our former curators for textiles said, when she retired, she said, well, it was so wonderful to work in the Rijksmuseum, because over the 40 years that I worked there, often people come, and old families from the Netherlands came and would have said, well, we can either throw it in the dustbin or we give it to the Rijksmuseum. So it indicates that and the Rijksmuseum was very generous at taking it on, and it indicates that these decisions in the 19th century, in a lot of European houses and a lot of Dutch houses, objects that became very valuable and told us a lot about our history were thrown away. Sometimes objects that might not have a great value money-wise, but have a great cultural value. And I think that makes the Rijksmuseum, that it was really built by the people, and donations came of objects from the families in the Netherlands, which made it a museum for everybody, and with such a strong Dutch character in its collections. But then over the 20th century, the museum was slowly filled in. These were the courtyards. I don't know if you, let's see if I can, no. These were the courtyards. They were built in with all kind of small walls. And the large spaces that were there, this was the Gallery of Honor, and they were thinking about building that in as well, but they kept it open. This was the other courtyard that was built in. Large spaces were made smaller and smaller, and during the 20th century, with the period of the democratizing in the 1950s and 60s, these were built in the 50s and 60s, it was felt that you needed to democratize the building. So the building that was meant to impress, with large spaces where you could wander, the spaces were made into small spaces, so it would give more a sense of scale. It ended up being a labyrinth where nobody could find their way. That's when you have, I know I'm in the country of democracy, but when you have too much democracy, nobody can find their way. So that's what it ended up like. But it's interesting that when we started to work on the history of the museum, at that time, it wasn't such a conscious decision. But then when you read around it, then you read the correspondence over it, it was really a sign of the time of the 1960s that things had to be human scale, they should be smaller, and thus it resulted also in the National Museum of this way of filling in the museum. It was clustered with offices, with energy rooms. The conservation studios were in the attic, and the building was really a labyrinth. This is how it was physically built in. So here you see the old walls of the museum, and here they just built in nice little spaces. So when in 2000 the country felt quite rich, a millennium gift was given to the museum to make the museum fit for the 21st century. The government only provided for the bricks, and we raised the money ourselves for the content and for the display. At that time, there was an international competition, and it was maybe quite ironic, but I think they were fantastic architects, that in this museum of the Dutch 17th century, that young country that fought against the Spanish, Cruz y Ortiz, two Spanish architects, were chosen to take the Rijksmuseum into the 21st century. But on the other hand, a very logical choice, because it was the time of the unification of Europe, where it was felt you should have an international staff also in the museum working on it. And they did quite a job, as you can see here. Not single-handedly, we helped, but they did two amazing things. They said we should go forwards with Kuiper, so forwards with the architect of the building. And I think the idea not to want to go back to the original architecture, but to take it forwards was a very good one. And they said, we want to give the museum light and air back again. We want to give it its lungs back. If you would look at the museum, there's two courtyards are really like two lungs that open it up. And they took out all these small rooms that were created in the courtyards. And this was quite a rigorous decision. And I think that with the renovation of the museum, or the transformation of the museum, we took quite a few rigorous decisions. The rigorousness of it was that there was no architect who would, in his right mind, who would propose to have rather fewer exhibition galleries than more exhibition galleries. So at first, the curators, I was one of the curators, I just joined. Everybody said, why are you going to join a museum that's going to close? I said, well, that's a great opportunity to be able to work on this new museum. They took out the inner courts, so less is more was the motto for the new museum. Less is more. And they decided to go back to the original floor plan. So this is nearly the same. This is our if you come into the museum, this is our floor plan nowadays. This is nearly the same as it was at the beginning. They also had another thing that they wanted to. It was meant as a city gate as well, so you could go under the museum with a bicycle. And you might have heard, and I said once to our former director, it was great that they wanted to take the bicycles out of the passageway under the museum, because it kept us in the international press for the 10 years that we were renovating. But I'm very happy that you can now cycle under it, because it's unique in the world that you have a museum where you could actually have a cycle path under it. But to arrive at this, which has a great simplicity, we learned that simplicity is usually the most difficult thing to arrive at. And in the Netherlands, if you start to build, you need, I remember the Spanish architect saying to me, if you make a cellar under the Prado, which they'd done, you take a spade and you dig. If you make a cellar under the Rijksmuseum, you have to hire a captain at sea, because you immediately hit the water. So all the building was done with divers under the water, and it was a huge building process to arrive at this result as it is now, which really opened it up. It breathes again, the museum, and it has nearly a Spanish light falling through this chandelier that they designed, which is, some people thought it would be a cage if you don't pay for your ticket, but it has all security. It has the acoustics and everything in it, and they decided to use only Spanish stone to counterbalance use a very minimalist language to counterbalance the very eclectic architecture of Cuypers, who at his time only used Dutch materials. In the 19th century, they wanted to only use Dutch stones, the red ones being from one river, from the Waal, as we called it, and the yellow ones being from the IJssel, another river. And the front hall, which was restored back into its former glory. We felt that at some point, at some places in the museum, you should actually be able to experience the museum as a building, but also as a part of the collection, as it really is so much part of the collection in the story it tells. It was completely, during the 20th century, you will see slides later, it was completely painted white. On the one hand, because we wanted to turn it into a Protestant church, and what do? You paint everything white. And funnily enough, if you will see in the collection of the Van Otterloos and of the Weatherbees, you will see paintings by Sanredam. And the architect in the 1950s who painted the interior of the Rijksmuseum white, he took a painting by Sanredam as an example and said, this is how I want it to look. So it was painted white. You now can't imagine anymore. An organ was hung, because that's in a Protestant church, you have an organ on either side of the front hall, and large copper chandeliers from the 17th century, also like in churches, were hung there. We had it restored back, and this part needed least reconstruction, because these are not frescoes, but there were paintings. They had been rolled up in the beginning of the 20th century, and when they were discovered in the 1960s, the then director ordered the conservators to destroy them and to throw them away, but they didn't do it. They hid them in the attic, and we found them again. So we restored them, put them up again, and these are the stained glass windows I was talking about before, which had stayed, probably because the Dutch are quite mean, and they functioned as windows, so they were left there. They weren't taken out. All the decorations were done by training a new generation of artisans who worked with stencils. It's all stenciled. And they were, because the building work took 10 years and there was a lot of delay in the building work, they were able to do so much of the reconstruction work within the museum. So in a sense, the delays and the long period of the renovation were used very well by the staff. This is how the Gallery of Honor looked before the museum closed down. The decorations on these beams were saved because they felt modernist. They're steel beams, and it was thought that that's modern age, steel, you have to preserve it. So they were always preserved, but the rest of the walls, everything was painted white. But what do you do when you start to renovate a building? You want to have the original volumes back, and you want to have it breathe great simplicity. Also to get here, great simplicity, but it was a hell of a job to get there. I remember when we were building, it suddenly appeared that the State Department had decided to have every 3 meters an electricity socket. Or you would have security lights everywhere. And to get the walls like this, I mean, you probably remember from the renovations here, it's near impossibility. But we did it, but we also thought, if you can rethink the institution, how, and you have these museums, 3 museums in it, history, fine art, and applied art, where each material starts in the Middle Ages up to the 20th century, how can you make it an experience for the visitor that's more understandable? You don't have to start over and over again with history. And we decided that, in a sense, the Rijksmuseum is like the memory of a nation. And how do we order our own memory? It's chronological. You think about, when did I do my finals, when did I go to study, when did I get married or not, or when did I have my first child, etc. And around that you order, in a chronological sense, your memories. At that time, at around 2000, this was unheard of, because with postmodernism, history shouldn't be chronological. But we did decide to do it that way. And the motto next to less is more was mix the collections where you can alongside, and create a sense of time and a sensibility for beauty. So you walk through the Middle Ages to the 17th century. This is a painting by Bergheide of the Golden Band, we call it, the Golden Mile of the city of Amsterdam. Then the canals, when this was at the time they were built in 1772, to the 18th century, the age of decorative art in the Netherlands, to the 19th century, the first impressionist self-portrait by Van Gogh, after his brother told him, you should paint in light colors and start painting people, that's the way you earn money, and this is what it produced. And then because this is also one of my favorite paintings, Breitner. And into the 20th century. There was a lot of discussion, should the museum enter the 20th century? And we felt, yes, we should, because we're now living in the 21st century. So I'm sorry to say, including me, we're all history. So time goes on, and you go on also with the collection. And we collect the 20th century, not as avant-garde, but as reflective and as in the long tradition of art and applied arts and history in the Netherlands. And it always has a historical link. Another foreigner, Jean-Michel Wilmot, was invited to design the galleries. He started off doing it in 2003, and it became a friendship over 10 years, with which really the curators and his design company and him worked together very closely. And these were the discussions we had. You probably recognize them, but it just went on and on. But I do have to say, if we would have done the building in 5 years, the installations, we wouldn't have been able to hide behind saying, oh, we didn't really finish, so it could have been better. I think now we did the best we could, and it's for the public to judge how that is, but we really had the time and the possibility to think the installations through up into the last minute detail. And this is what the result was. These are the medieval galleries. And I think one of the great things why we chose Wilmot, the French designer, was that he really presents the objects to the public on a platter. It's yours, and it's like a gift to the public, and it's very accessible. You really feel that you're in direct contact with the work of art. On the one hand, with the single work of art, and I think that that's always very important, that you can stand in front of a work of art without being distracted by the works around it. On the other hand, at the same time being able to get a sense of time and beauty, that when you walk through it, you see that the art of the Middle Ages was different from that of the 17th century. We didn't want to make, like they did here in the old museum, period rooms, because it gives the impression to the public that these objects really belong together, where they never did. So we decided to make rooms, and you might recognize here this with this one, to have rooms where this is the 17th century, and this is about the administration of the cities and of the country. Here you see the board of one of the administrative bodies. I think this is for the spinsters. So there's a woman, so for single women of a certain age, and these were the men administering their condo, I think you would call it in the US, their hofje, um, where they lived. And these were the female administrators of the lepers house. So it was always, you had male administrative bodies and also female administrative bodies. So we do give an impression, but it's clear that these objects, or these two, do belong together, but they were not in the same room as that one originally. So not period rooms, but giving a time of sense and beauty. The question often asked, but why these dark walls? There were no museums at that time that were having these dark walls, and it was through a visit to our conservation department that uses grey on the wall that Villemotte came to the idea and said, we were for a long time struggling with all kind of colors, and he said, why do they have grey? And I said, that's because it's the most neutral color against, and a very peaceful color for the restorer to restore against. And it is also with dark colors that your eye has, your pupil opens more, so it admits also more color to come in to your eye. So it was a very rational decision he made, and I think it worked out very well. Because the paintings really become like windows, and they're frames like windowsills through which you look into the 17th century. Objects, this would have been, it's an important object by Van Vianen, which depicts one of the battles within that 80-year war. Objects which used to have been with the silver department, silver and gold department, are now, here you see them together with other objects, but are now exhibited like this. It's here, standing here, together with paintings, a cannon, and a funerary monument sketch of the same period. So they are in their historical context, but giving again also a sense of beauty. Here we see Rembrandt, and there Rembrandt, together with his friends, Lutma, a silversmith, and Domer, a furniture designer. So also again you have a group of artists that you show together who were friends in real life. In the 18th century, we have two period rooms, which are really rooms that in their entirety were taken from the canals and exhibited in the museum. It's also the 18th century beautiful sculpture of L'Amour Ménaissant, which was made for Madame de Pompadour. And one of the two only tables that exist by Piranesi. The museum is, if you see it here, it's less is more, but the museum has huge reserves. We've got over 1 million objects in the collection, and to give an idea of that, we made what we call the special collection, which is like a treasure trove where you really see lots of glass, lots of earthenware, lots of Meissen porcelain. It's after Dresden the largest collection of Meissen in the world. And then we come to Irma Bohm, the person who designed our new logo, and also she wanted to radiate simplicity in her work, but she did it in a very joyful way. She came up with the new logo for the museum, and we had again a national competition, and they were the most amazing Baroque kind of drawings with bicycles running through the word and everything that you could imagine. And she asked me one day, well, Taco, what is the strongest brand you know? And I think I said Chanel, and then she said, yeah, I think it's a word. You just need the word Rijksmuseum. And nobody in the world can pronounce it, but a lot of people know it because it's so difficult to pronounce. So just believe in what you are as an institution, and just have the word as your logo. So we designed we let her design the guidebooks and all the publications we do in a very contemporary design, because we feel that also old art is of all days, it's always contemporary, and we want it to be relevant now and also appeal to a young audience now. And I think it works in a sense also online. We started online with what we call Rijksstudio. We were the first to give all our images for free on the internet in the highest resolution. With the idea came, because of the music industry as well, it's very difficult to control your copyrights. We had 3 people working on it, but their pay was higher than what they could actually claim in copyrights, because on the internet, their images are, if you've made a photograph of the night watch, you can use it anywhere because there's no copyright on it anymore. So there we also said simplicity. This is just, well, I'll skip it, because we believe we want to have, in our digital presence, we want to be inside the museum as low-tech as possible. I hate it when you go to a museum and there's a computer screen and it doesn't work, and it's always maintenance, but it's also, it distracts you from the real work of art, from the object. And we believe that especially if you're outside of the museum, you can be as high-tech as possible. And we're living in the right time, because the internet is so much based on images. And we strongly believe in the power of the image, so you have to have it in a very high resolution on the screen. And also it's a great educational tool, because children should learn and can learn in a museum to develop a critical sense and a critical eye for analyzing images, which you get every day. And the great thing with being online is that the power of the image, it intrigues you, and 24/7, and you can touch it, something that you can't do in the museum. The other thing is we felt you have to be able to play with the collection. So we did not only allow people to download the image at the highest resolution, but people could also use the images to make products. And there was one Dutch fashion designer, and she made these dresses with images from the collections, and they're now one of the best-selling items in our shop. And the great thing is, it's publicity for the museum, because when they walk over the street, people look at it and they think, oh, that's a beautiful image, or oh, that's a beautiful dress. So it is the way to bring the collection really to the people. And what better way there is to have it on the milk carton, where you buy a milk carton. And I remember myself because this was proposed by one of the large grocery stores in the Netherlands, Albert Heijn, and they proposed to do this, and I said, yeah, that's fine, but we also have, it's not only for pleasure, but we also have a mission statement, which is education. So as a child, you would often sit at the breakfast table and look while your parents were talking at the milk carton, and we decided to have a little educational text with a riddle, and as a child you could then read, if you turn the milk carton around, you first have to finish it, you could read the answer, but at least it stimulates you to really, it embrands the images into your mind and onto your eye, and it stimulates you to learn something. So be present in unexpected places, and be present in every household of your town. This is a photograph, for us it seems long ago, 2013, when we had the national opening, and something that we consider as typical Dutch, but it's actually typically American, is the brass bands. We had from every county in the country a brass band come and play, and it really became, we had the opening, our development department was hugely nervous, because we said we're not going to have an opening for special guests, we just have an opening for everybody one day for free, and the Queen opened it and everybody could go to the museum one day for free. When I called our main sponsors, they all immediately said that's a great idea to do, because it really shows that you're everybody's museum, and I think that's what we want to be. And do not believe, these were the queues at the beginning when we opened. Our logistics are now better, so when you come to the museum, you won't find a queue. We have about 2 to 2.5 million visitors a year. And the thought we had as museums at the beginning of the 21st century, that by being on the internet and by living in a day and age where there's so much digital and so much kind of virtual reality, and by everybody being able to travel, we thought, well, what's the function of a museum? I remember Bill Gates saying that he would have great plasma screens in his house with the masterpieces of all over the world on them, and he wouldn't need to buy art. I think since he's bought art, and it proves that for all of us, having the collection on the internet only stimulates people to come and see the real thing. We sometimes forget it, but we all want real things. When we go to Tuscany, we want to eat Tuscan food and we want to drink Tuscan wine, but we also want to see the Tuscan art. When people come to the Netherlands, they want to see the art that was made at the place. So I think the real object, the authentic object, is the strength of the museum, and that's our core business as well. And bringing that to the people and making it everybody's museum. I think you cannot be emphasized more than enough as a museum that you're an open museum, and you have to really be there for everybody, because everybody has the right to see art. This is where I stop. Probably spoke far too long, so I'll shut up now. Maybe for those who still have time, if we can take some questions.
Yeah, I apologize for the simple question, but how is Rijks translated into
State.
English? State.
State museum. But to be clear, we are 1/3 state financed, 1/3 private donations, and 1/3 ticket sales. So that's changed over the past 10 years. The Dutch museums have always charged, so it's different from the US or the UK.
What was the effect of the years of German occupation on the museum?
It's interesting because I just read a booklet that was published by the museum in the end of the 40s. The museum hardly had ever. We are now in a large. We have a research project to research the 110,000 objects that entered the museum from 1933 up to the present day, to research their provenance. And we have a website where all the objects of which the provenance is not entirely closed over that period are published. But during the period of the German occupation, so 1940 to 45, there was hardly any acquisition at the museum because there was no money. It closed its door quite soon. The art was all brought to first one location, then to another location, and then to a third location. But it is very impressive to read. The museum did a small exhibition of the Rijksmuseum during the Second World War in the 1980s, and there it's awful to see how far the system of the occupation reached. So it was more for admitting people. Jewish people weren't allowed, and then they discovered that the then director did allow them, and the Germans threatened to incarcerate him. So it was really went quite, in that sense, went very deep, but the museum closed, I think it was 1941, and after the Second World War, when it was opened again, there was an exhibition, the Weerzien der Meesters, the coming back of the masterpieces, and that was very well attended. It's museums, and that's also what I try to indicate, is that museums, national museums, play a very important role, not only as a reflection of the time itself, but they also make the time itself, and art becomes very important at times of war. So it was actually amazing that there was so little art. A lot of the art was hidden during the Second World War, that so little was transported to Germany. And I think the reason, or we know the reason for that, was that the Germans tried to get the Dutch on their side by saying that there would be a great Netherlands with the Flemish Dutch as one country. Flanders and the Netherlands had already been separated for over a century, but they wanted to rebuild that. And for that idea, they had the identity of Dutch art. But that luckily never came to be. So.
I was curious about the recent joint acquisition with the Louvre of the two Rembrandt pendant paintings.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, sort of, as the price for art continues to increase, do you see that perhaps becoming a sustainable model in which, countries can continue to hope to keep these wonderful works of art in the public domain?
I think it's a difficult subject. In this case, it's also a very interesting subject. I didn't include it. It's a long story. But the Rijksmuseum wanted to acquire, or had a dream to acquire, pendants, the only full-length pendants standing painted by Rembrandt from the Rothschild family in France, from the French branch. They were willing to sell them to us. They had an export license, and we were able to raise the money. It was a lot of money, 160 million. And at the moment that we were actually, or that it was said in the press that we had acquired them, the French put their foot down and said, no, this is not going to happen. So they said, but we are willing to share them, because they knew that legally they couldn't withhold the sale. And then you see the Netherlands, it's a small country, so you always have to navigate quite diplomatically. And France is a large country. So at the UN in New York, it was decided by by Hollande, the then Prime Minister of France, and our Prime Minister, that it was communicated by Hollande that we were going to buy them together. So then the two were bought together. It was possible because there were two paintings. And then it was the first time, I think, in history that a treaties between two countries, so not an agreement, but a treaties over works of art, usually it's tunnels or motorways, was actually made, that these two works of art should always be considered as one. But again, that's also a sign of the time that with the unification of Europe, that was a possibility. And well, we don't know. I'm sure it will work out because we're on very good terms with the Louvre, but you don't know if maybe in 100 years' time there's a war between the two countries. You never know. But I hope not, because I like France.
Hi, I came from China over 20 years ago, and you introduced some wonderful art piece here. Is this museum having some really treasure pieces from China back to, I think Holland is one of the 8 countries went to China at the end of 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. A lot of all the 8th country, the other countries I know, they grabbed a lot of Chinese arts.
Well, there's two, sorry to interrupt you, but the Dutch came to China already a century before, in the beginning of the 17th century, and that incited a cultural exchange, and you have Chinese export that was basically exported by the Dutch, all by the Dutch they took over from the Portuguese who were before them, to Europe and sold all over Europe. That's why everywhere in Europe you find Chinese porcelain. So that was Chinese export. And then only in the 20th century we started to collect Chinese art, as in archaeological art. So from from, I think the oldest piece we have is 1000 or 2000 BC. But that was that started in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, following the French fashion, late 19th century fashion for Asiatic art. But yes, there is a collection of Chinese art. It's not very big, but the export art collection is very big. And we did, together with the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, we did an exhibition a few years ago on this relation between China and other countries in Asia and the Netherlands.
Thank you.
A very simple question is, I love this sculpture slide, and I'm wondering if that is Qualinus. Is the sculpture Qualinus?
No, it's not. It's not Qualinus. It's Falconet. It's the sculptor. It's a French. It's part of a French collection of the Rijksmuseum. The Rijksmuseum has a strong collection of French applied arts and sculpture, and this is Falconet, and he made it for Madame de Pompadour.
And what does the rest of this sculpture show? What is the boy doing?
Yeah, he's. You probably hope something naughty, but it's not that naughty. Wait, I'll just show it because we had it. Where was it? I thought I showed it, but did I pass it? Okay. Here, that's him. The fascinating thing, it's on its original stand, and here you see the handles, and you can turn it. So you could really, it was really meant to be turned very slowly and be admired. And he's basically l'amour menaçant. He's basically, he's always there. So, yeah. No, but it's wonderful, and it does remind you of Qualinus. Qualinus is one of the most important Flemish emigre artists. A lot of artists came from Flanders to the Netherlands over the 17th century, including the family of Frans Hals, who's Flemish, or etc., etc. And Qualinus it's very much the same style. Okay, well, thank you very much.